Feathers are one of the most defining traits of birds, quite literally inseparable from the very idea of what a bird is. And yet, feathers are even older than the birds themselves, being an ancestral trait shared with their closest relatives, the non avian dinosaurs. During the Mesozoic, several groups of dinosaurs possessed their own forms of feathers, including the mighty tyrannosaurs. A fact we've come to learn thanks to a truly puzzling bird-like tyrant, one that was small but holds the title of king, called Dilong. Dilong is a small tyrannosaur from what is now China, having lived approximately 126 million years ago during the early Cretaceous period, a whole 60 million years before its larger cousin T.rex. While it may not look the part thanks to its smaller size, Dilong is a close cousin to the Tyrant King, being part of the same superfamily, Tyrannosauroidea, a group of carnivorous dinosaurs most closely related to Tyrannosaurus. On the surface, they may look starkly different, especially with the contrasting size of Dilong only growing to 2 meters or 6 feet as opposed to the gigantic 40-foot Tyrannosaurus. Upon closer inspection, however, there are some key similarities that bring the two together. One only has to look beneath that surface level, to the skeletons. It's here the similarities become much more clear. Dilong, despite its smaller size, possesses the unmistakable anatomical traits of a tyrannosaur. Long D-shaped teeth, a Y-shaped skull crest, composed of 2 large ridges at the top of the skull, and a large ridge in the hip bone, a characteristic only found in tyrannosaurs that help make them agile predators. It's these characteristics that help paleontologists identify Dilong and many other basal tyrannosaurs as part of the family, through a process called phylogenetics, the study of an organism or organisms' collective evolutionary history based on observable inherited traits. While these traits have allowed us to identify Dilong as the tyrannosaur, they've also made it somewhat difficult to place Dilong on the tyrannosaur family tree. It was certainly primitive by tyrannosaur standards. Often the consensus is that Dilong is a basal tyrannosauroid, sitting somewhere in the middle between the 3-fingered proceratosaurids and the 2-fingered tyrannosaurids. It's this same process that has allowed scientists to unravel the connections between dinosaurs and birds, thanks to their various, shared, sometimes identical, anatomical traits, even amongst tyrannosaurs, who in particular possess strikingly similar leg bones to those of modern radites like ostriches, thanks to specialized metatarsal bones and especially long legs in proportion to their bodies. Adaptations that made them just as adept at running as any ostrich. Surprisingly, Dilong doesn't quite possess these cursorial leg bones, lacking the specialized metatarsals in their feet that made their cousins such specialized runners. Nevertheless, Dilong were still very agile hunters, a title emphasized by the inner workings of its brain. A study published in 2018 compared the preserved brain cases of Dilong and Tyrannosaurus rex, and found the two were actually quite disparate despite being related, with their brains differing in shape and configuration, with Dilong having a distinctly S-shaped brain in comparison to Tyrannosaurus. In fact, its brain had distinct similarities to those of Archaeopteryx and Ornithomimids. Furthermore, its sinuses were shaped rather differently than those of later tyrannosaurs, while having a very large section devoted to motor control, called the flocus. This very large flocus was indicative of a fast and agile animal, with a brain able to process and balance Dilong as it leapt and strode through the forests of Cretaceous China. However, with every give, there was a takeaway. While Dilong may have been an agile hunter, it was lacking in the smell department, an adaptation that this bloodline is notorious for, to say the least. with Dilong's brain showcasing that it didn't possess the highly developed sense of smell of later tyrannosaurs. In addition, another study focusing on the brain cases of tyrannosaurs, like Evolutionary, indicates that the changing of Dilong's S-shaped brain to a more linear shape was likely due to the group's increase in size over time, essentially evolving differently structured brains as they began to occupy different roles in the environment. Research into the jaws and skull of Dilong showcased that while it did share several feeding mechanisms with later, larger tyrannosaurs, including the structures and shapes of the jaws and teeth, it's likely that Dilong was a very different animal than its descendants, despite having similar mechanisms for feeding and biting. A study published in 2023 examined these adaptations in more depth across Tyrannosauroidea, in order to analyze the different feeding methods and niches of different groups of tyrannosaurs. Compared to most other tyrannosaurs, Dilong had more in common with the feeding mechanisms of the smaller, more primitive Proceratosaurs. But something truly interesting is that the biomechanics of their bites showed even lower cranial stress compared to juvenile tyrannosaurids, like Tarbosaurus and Tyrannosaurus, with juvie Tarbosaurus outperforming them in the amount of cranial stress they could withstand. It was suggested that based on Dilong's lower cranial stress, it was probably hunting smaller prey compared to its later cousins. And yet, it was already developing adaptations like fused nasal bones to help reduce the stress of struggling prey. An adaptation that would not only be inherited by its descendants, but grow more pronounced in tyrannosaurids in order to aid in giving them more powerful bite forces. Adaptations like these make Dilong a crucial marker for analyzing these traits and how they specialized in later tyrannosaurs, marking an evolutionary pathway we can observe through the development of these traits. This especially applies to the relatively longer arms of Dilong. You see, despite being related to T-rex, Dilong had fairly long arms in proportion to its body, with 3 fingers on each hand if that wasn't enough. These traits would have allowed this little predator to snatch up even smaller prey animals, or grapple with equally sized prey or competitors. The arms themselves are an ancestral condition of tyrannosaurs, with many older, more basal members of the family, like Guanlong and Susquityrannus, also possessing fairly long arms in proportion to their bodies. So if Dilong represents what the ancestors of Tyrannosaurus and other later tyrants looked like, why did their arms shrink as they grew larger? While your first thought might be, well, because Tyrannosaurs didn't need them because they got bigger. And while it is noteworthy that Tyrannosaurus had more specialized skulls for capturing prey, we do have large tyrannosaurs like Dryptosaurus, Electrosaurus, and Yutyrannus with long arms. And while the Tyrannosaurids had tiny arms with only 2 fingers, contrary to what you might think, their arms weren't useless. Biomechanical tests show that these arms were capable of full ranges of motion, and what's more, could lift over 40 kilograms in each arm. So if their arms were so strong, what were they doing with them? Perhaps the answer was staring us right in the face this whole time. We can see that Tyrannosaurus and its closest kin inherited an important trait from Dilong in their arms: large, powerful claws at the tips of their fingers. It's possible that these arms worked in tandem to the powerful jaws of large tyrannosaurs. Jaws that were not only used to crunch through bone when feeding, but also used to clamp down on prey when hunting. And it's possible that when wrestling with similar sized prey, the strong arms would help to hook into the flesh of these animals, acting as extra anchors for the tyrants to stabilize themselves when wrestling with thrashing prey. Dilong itself was likely a formidable predator, and while it certainly wasn't hunting giant herbivores, there was a plethora of small to similar sized animals to choose from, like the early horned dinosaur Psittacosaurus or the large predatory mammal Repanomamus. Tyrannosaurs like Tyrannosaurus may have inherited another trait from Dilong, one that this genus in particular is especially known for: feathers. When Dilong was described in 2004, it was the first tyrannosaur ever found to have feathers. In fact, it's how the currently known species of Dilong got its name, Dilong paradoxus, meaning the Dragon Emperor paradox, because of how truly baffling the presence of feathers were on this tyrannosaur. The feathers of Dilong were quite different to those of many modern birds, lacking a central shaft characteristic to the more pugnacious feathers found in flying birds today. Instead, being much more similar to the downy feathers of bird chicks. This similarity in structure indicates that Dilong used these feathers in a similar fashion. Instead of flight, they were more for keeping warm and regulating their body temperature, which in itself is additional evidence pointing towards non-avian dinosaurs being warm-blooded animals. The similarities between the downy coats of Dilong and those of bird chicks is no coincidence. Many genera of non-avian dinosaurs like Sinosauropteryx and Calindrodromeus also possess downy coatings, and the fact that they share this trait with modern birds as well as each other has helped shed light on the origins of feathers themselves. However, the flame of another big question was fanned from the presence of feathers on Dilong. If the ancestors of Tyrannosaurus had feathers, did the Tyrant King itself have feathers? It's a question that's been the source of hot debate for decades, one that's still raging on today. And with Dilong in the picture, it's only complicated the discussion. Some have suggested that the smaller tyrannosaurs retained their feathers while the larger members lacked them, with size having a correlation with feathers and their feather distribution. However, this grew more complicated when Eutyrannus was described in 2012, a feathered tyrannosaur that grew 33 feet long and was fully draped in feathers. So if Eutyrannus had them, what's stopping the others? As a result, an alternative hypothesis was proposed, that perhaps instead of being correlated with size, feathers were only possessed by basal tyrannosaurs, and as they evolved, they gradually lost them. These days, the answer is often treated as an in-between, with the likelihood of feathers growing even more evident with more preserved feathered dinosaurs and the growing understanding of the evolution of feathers. As such, it's often suggested that Tyrannosaurus had feathers but weren't completely covered, either having a thinner, fine layer of feathering, or feathers only being concentrated on certain parts of the body. Whatever the case may be, the feathers of Dilong not only connect the Tyrannosaur lineage to birds, but ultimately other dinosaurs as a whole, helping paleontologists understand the evolution of feathers in these animals, as something that might be even much older than the dinosaurs themselves. Dilong may not be the biggest tyrannosaur, but its contributions to paleontology are on a massive scale that truly make it an emperor amongst tyrants.